The wind moved softly across the empty ranch, carrying only silence where laughter once lived. The fences still stood strong, the horses still ran free, but something deep in the heart of Heartland had changed forever. They say a man's spirit lingers in the places he loved most. And on this cold morning, you could almost feel Tim Fleming's presence in the mist, fading yet somehow still there. The sun struggled to rise that morning, as if even the sky didn't want to face the truth. The fields of Heartland were covered in a thin layer of fog, the kind that makes everything seem distant, dreamlike, unreal. Amy walked out of the house slowly, her boots pressing softly into the damp earth. She wasn't ready to face the day, but something inside her told her she had to. Heartland had always been about strength, about facing storms, loss, and pain, and today, that strength was being tested more than ever. The world around her looked the same, but everything inside her had shifted. The barn stood tall as always, but the air felt heavy, as if time itself was holding its breath. She looked toward the paddock where her father used to train the horses, hearing faint echoes of his voice guiding her, "Keep your hands steady. Amy, the horse feels what you feel." For a moment, she could almost see him there, head tilted, arms crossed, that proud yet stubborn smile. But the image faded quickly, replaced by the truth she still couldn't accept. Inside the house, the phone still sat on the kitchen counter. That same phone had carried the call that broke everything. The call that came just before sunrise. Amy still remembered the tone of the voice on the other end, gentle, careful, as if afraid to break her completely. "I'm sorry. There's been an accident." That's all it took for her world to collapse. A ride, a quiet morning, and then nothing. Tim Fleming was gone. Just like that. No warning, no goodbye. Jack was sitting by the fireplace when Amy walked back in. He hadn't said a word since the news came. His eyes were fixed on the flames, his jaw tight, his hands still. Jack had been through more than most men ever would, but this loss seemed to strike something deeper. Tim wasn't just family. He was the boy Jack had raised, the man he had fought with and forgiven countless times. There had always been tension between them, but beneath it all, there was love, strong, stubborn love that words could never fully express. Lou had taken charge of everything, like she always did. She was making calls, organizing, holding everyone together while trying not to fall apart herself. Every time her voice cracked, she'd cover it with a quick breath and keep going. "We'll handle it," she kept saying. "We'll be okay." But everyone knew she was saying it more to herself than anyone else, because nothing about this felt okay. The ranch dog, Remy, lay near the porch, his head resting on Tim's old work boots. He hadn't moved since yesterday. It was as if even he understood that something precious had been taken from them. The horses were restless too, pacing in their stalls, nickering softly, as if searching for the familiar footsteps that would never return. Heartland had always been full of life, of movement, laughter, and the rhythm of family, but now, every sound felt like an echo from another time. Amy walked to the barn, running her hand along the wooden door Tim had repaired just last month. It still carried the smell of fresh pine and varnish. She pushed it open slowly. The air inside was cool and quiet. His tools were still hanging neatly on the wall, his hat still resting on the hook by the door. For a long time, she just stood there, staring, her eyes tracing every detail as if memorizing it for the last time. It was strange how objects could hold memories so tightly. Every nail, every rope, every saddle whispered a story. Her heart felt heavy, but there was also a calmness beneath the grief, something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was love, or maybe it was the deep knowing that her father's spirit wasn't truly gone. Heartland had a way of keeping people close, even when they left this world. Amy took a deep breath, closing her eyes. "You're still here," she whispered softly, almost afraid to hear her own voice. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees, and for a fleeting second, it felt like he answered. The day had started like any other at Heartland, but within hours, everything was changed forever. It began with the sound of a phone ringing sharp, unexpected, and somehow louder than usual, echoing through the quiet house. Amy was brushing down Spartan when she heard it. She didn't rush. She never did. But something about that sound made her heart skip, like a whisper of dread curling around her ribs. She wiped her hands on her jeans and walked toward the kitchen, her boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. When she picked up the phone, the world didn't stop right away. It took a few seconds for the words to find their way through her. The voice on the other end was calm but careful, each word shaped with a kind of practiced sorrow. "Miss Fleming, I'm afraid I have some difficult news." That paused the long, breathless silence before the truth was enough for Amy to know. She didn't hear every detail after that. The words "heart attack" and "out on the trail" floated through the air like dust motes, heavy and impossible to grasp. Her mind went blank, her body frozen. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. The next moments blurred together. Lou came rushing in, her face pale, her voice demanding answers. Jack appeared in the doorway, his eyes already filled with the kind of fear only a father could feel. Amy couldn't speak. She just stood there, the receiver hanging loose in her hand. The silence that followed was thicker than any storm that had ever passed through Heartland. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to stop out of respect for what had just been said. Jack was the first to move. He walked forward slowly, placed a firm hand on Amy's shoulder, and gently took the phone. He spoke quietly with the officer on the line, his voice low and steady, though every muscle in his face trembled. "We'll come down," he said. When he hung up, he didn't turn around right away. He just stood there, shoulders heavy, as if the weight of decades had suddenly pressed down on him. When he finally looked at them, the truth was written across his face. No one needed to hear it out loud. Still, Lou whispered, "He's gone." "Isn't he?" Jack nodded once, just once, and that small movement shattered the air. Lou sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Amy stepped back, clutching the edge of the counter to steady herself. For a long moment, no one spoke. The house that had always been full of life, arguments, laughter, and music now felt hollow, an empty shell echoing with memories outside. The wind began to rise, brushing through the trees as if nature itself mourned the loss. The horses grew restless, neighing softly, their hoofs shifting in the dirt. Spartan lifted his head, ears twitching toward the house. Animals always sensed what humans couldn't put into words. Amy finally stepped outside, the cold air burning her skin. She looked out toward the hills, her mind replaying every moment she'd ever had with her father. The arguments, the reconciliations, the lessons, the laughter, all of it flooded her like a storm she couldn't outrun. She remembered the last thing he'd said to her just a few days ago. "You're stronger than you think, Amy. You've got that from your mom and a little from me." It hadn't seemed important then. Just one of those passing remarks he made when he didn't want to say something too emotional. But now, standing alone in the open air, those words cut deeper than anything else. Stronger than you think. Maybe he had known. Maybe he had felt something coming. Lou came out a few minutes later, her eyes red, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stood beside Amy without speaking. They didn't need words. Sometimes grief is too big for language. The sky was turning gray, the light fading faster than usual. Jack joined them, his steps slow, deliberate. He stood between them, and for the first time in years, the three of them leaned into each other like they used to when life got too heavy. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore, it was shared, a fragile thread holding them together. As evening fell, people began to arrive. Neighbors, friends, even strangers from town who had known Tim in one way or another. The yard filled with murmurs of disbelief, hugs that lasted too long, and eyes that avoided meeting one another for fear of breaking down. Tim had been a complicated man, flawed, fiery, stubborn, but he was loved. He had built, broken, and rebuilt more bridges than most people ever dared to cross. His loss wasn't simple. It was layered, tangled, and deeply human. Amy found herself standing near the barn again, watching the lights flicker on inside the house as the night deepened. She thought about how life could be so cruelly sudden, how a man who had fought so hard to find peace could be taken away just when everything seemed right. There was no preparing for it, no warning. Death had come quietly, without ceremony. Leaving behind an ache that words could never soothe, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Goodbye, Dad." The wind answered with a soft rush through the trees, carrying with it a faint scent of hay and leather, the smell of every morning he'd ever spent in that barn. And for the first time since the call came, Amy felt the sting of tears she couldn't hold back. They fell silently, one by one, sinking into the soil of Heartland, the same soil her father had worked, the same ground that would now carry his memory forever. The night after Tim's passing stretched endlessly, a silence that wrapped itself around Heartland like a heavy blanket. Sleep was something no one could find. The house was filled with the faint creaks of the old wooden floors, the whisper of wind brushing against the windows, and the occasional soft sob that someone tried to hide. In a place that had always been full of energy, the stillness felt wrong, almost unnatural. It was as if the walls themselves knew that a piece of the ranch's soul had gone missing. Amy sat by the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. A cup of untouched tea sat in front of her, gone cold hours ago. The lamp above flickered gently, casting a warm, fragile glow. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers along the surface of the table, the same table where Tim had once sat, laughing loudly, arguing fiercely, dreaming big. The chair across from her fell to empty, to final. Every detail reminded her of him. The hat still on the peg by the door, the worn-out jacket hanging near the stairs, even the faint smell of saddle soap that seemed to linger wherever he had been in the living room. Lou had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching one of the old photo albums she'd pulled from the shelf. Jack sat by the fire again, his face lit by the soft, orange glow. He wasn't looking at the flames anymore. He was looking beyond them, somewhere deep inside his memories. He thought of the first time Tim had returned to Heartland years ago, stubborn and broken, yet hopeful in his own clumsy way. Jack had been angry then, not just at Tim, but at himself for not being able to fix what had once been broken between them. But over time, they'd built something stronger than forgiveness. They'd built understanding. And now, with Tim gone, that understanding had become a wound that no amount of wisdom could heal. Morning came too early. The ranch woke up, but without its rhythm. The horses stood quietly in their stalls, as if waiting for orders that would never come. The usual sounds, hoofbeats, doors opening, laughter drifting from the kitchen, were replaced by an unfamiliar hush. The smell of fresh hay, the sight of sunlight breaking over the hills, everything beautiful felt cruel now. Amy walked outside, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked around, almost expecting to see him there, yelling instructions, teasing her, or just being Tim. But the space he used to fill was now only air and memory. Lisa arrived from her trip that morning, her face pale with grief. She hugged Jack tightly, her hands trembling against his back. "I didn't even get to say goodbye," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of those simple words. Jack closed his eyes, holding her tighter, because there was nothing to say that could make any of it easier. Amy watched from the porch, feeling like she was outside of time itself, like everything around her was moving while she stood still. Later that afternoon, people began to bring food, as small towns always do when tragedy hits. Casseroles, pies, warm bread, acts of love wrapped in foil. The kitchen counters filled up with dishes that no one had an appetite for. But these gestures meant something. They reminded the family that they weren't alone. Heartland had always been more than land and fences. It was a community, a bond built through generations of love, loss, and rebuilding. Amy went out to the barn again. This time, she wasn't afraid of the quiet. She opened the door and let the sunlight spill across the floor. Dust particles floated in the air, moving slowly like fragments of old memories. Spartan stood in his stall, his dark eyes calm but searching. Amy walked up to him and rested her forehead against his. "He's gone, boy," she whispered. Spartan huffed softly, his breath warm against her skin, as if to say, "I know." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they didn't fall. She simply breathed, letting the grief settle into something quieter, something real. She noticed a half-finished saddle on the workbench one Tim had been fixing for a neighbor. His tools were still lined up neatly beside it. He had always been meticulous about his work. Amy picked up his hammer, feeling the weight of it in her hand. It was worn smooth from years of use, the handle shaped by his grip. For a moment, she closed her eyes and imagined his hands guiding hers like he used to when she was little. "Not too tight, Amy. You'll crack the leather." "Easy does it." His voice echoed faintly in her mind, warm and steady. Back in the house, Lou was making calls, arranging the funeral, handling the practical things because someone had to. Jack had gone out to the pasture, pretending to check the fences, though everyone knew he just needed to be alone. The weight of loss hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Yet, beneath it, there was something else stirring, something like unity. Grief had a strange way of pulling people together, even when words failed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Amy, Lou, and Jack stood together outside. They didn't say much. They just watched the sky change colors, the same sky Tim had looked at every morning. Amy took a deep breath and said softly, "He loved this view." Jack nodded, eyes glistening. "Yeah, he sure did." The wine carried a faint chill, and Amy closed her eyes, feeling it brush against her face. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of memories, of love, of everything that still remained. Tim was gone, but his presence was stitched into every corner of Heartland, the fields he rode, the barn he built, the family he fought for. And as the stars began to appear, one by one, Amy whispered into the night, "We'll keep it going." "Dad, I promise." The ranch stood quiet but alive, the way it always had. Because some legacies don't end, they just find new ways to keep breathing. The morning of the funeral arrived with a stillness so heavy that even the birds seemed to understand the need for silence. A thin veil of mist curled across the fields, softening the light as if the world itself was mourning. The Heartland Ranch, usually alive with sound and motion, stood frozen in quiet respect. Every board, every tree, every gust of wind seemed to carry a memory of him. The old barn, the fences he'd repaired, the trails he'd ridden, they were all pieces of a life that had ended too soon. Inside the house, Amy stood in front of the mirror, fixing the small silver locket around her neck, the one her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Her hands trembled as she clasped it. It had been years since she had opened it, but today she did. Inside it was a tiny picture of her mom, and Tim. They were smiling. Carefree, it felt like another lifetime. She closed it carefully, the soft click echoing like a promise she couldn't quite keep. In the living room, Lou was gathering flowers sent from friends and neighbors, arranging them into vases for the service. Her eyes were swollen and red, but her movements were steady. She had spent the past few days making sure everything was perfect, because that's what she did. She held everyone else together when she was breaking inside. "He'd hate all this fuss," she said softly, half to herself. Amy nodded faintly, a small, sad smile flickering across her lips. "Yeah," she whispered, but he'd pretend to like it anyway. Outside, Jack was already by the barn, dressed in his best jacket and an old cowboy hat that had seen too many years of sun. He leaned against the fence, staring at the open fields that stretched endlessly ahead. The land had always been a reflection of his heart, strong, scarred, but still standing. He thought about all the times he and Tim had fought, the words they couldn't take back, and the moments they wished they'd said more. But he also remembered the laughter, the stubborn pride, and the quiet peace that had grown between them over the years. "You did all right, son," he murmured to the wind. "You really did." As guests began to arrive, the front yard slowly filled with cars and the faint hum of quiet conversation. People came from all over Hudson, friends, neighbors, old rodeo buddies, and ranchers who had known Tim for decades. Each face carried the same mix of sorrow and disbelief. The pastor stood near a wooden cross that had been placed beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where Tim had once tied his horse every morning. Beneath it lay a simple wooden casket, polished but humble, surrounded by flowers from the ranch itself. Wildflowers, Amy's choice, because she said her father had always belonged to the wild more than anything else. The family took their seats at the front. Amy sat between Jack and Lou, her fingers gripping the edge of her dress to stop them from shaking. The pastor began to speak, his voice calm and gentle, echoing softly through the air. He talked about life and love, about how the mark a person leaves isn't measured in years, but in hearts. Amy barely heard the words. Her gaze stayed fixed on the casket. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's story, not her own. When it was time for the eulogies, Jack stood slowly. His hat stayed in his hand as he walked to the front. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The crowd waited, the air thick with emotion. When he finally did, his voice was rough but steady. Tim Fleming. He paused, taking a slow breath. He wasn't perfect, but he was honest. He was strong. And he had more fight in him than anyone I ever knew. Jack's eyes glistened as he looked out at the fields. He could be hard-headed, stubborn as a mule, but he had a good heart. He tried, Lord. He tried to make up for lost time. And he did. He loved this place, and he loved his family. I think, in the end, that's all any man can really hope for.